Israel has dampened hopes for peace in Gaza, saying it will pursue the war until it has achieved all of its aims. U.S. President Joe Biden has presented a proposal for a permanent ceasefire and the return of hostages held by Hamas. Crowds turned out in Tel Aviv to urge the government to accept the truce following months of rallies by hostage families demanding more actions to free their loved ones. Hamas has responded positively to the truce proposal. Biden says it would be a mistake to pass up a chance to end the war. Let's bring in Aaron David Miller now. He's an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and served as an advisor to several U.S. Secretaries of State. Welcome to the program. So I'd like to start off by asking you, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to start off by asking you what your take on the proposal is as it was laid out by President Biden.
I mean, it's a fine plan. It's phased. It's relatively realistic, although there's so much about phase 2 that needs to be negotiated and nailed down. Problem is not the text of a 4.5-page agreement. Problem is whether or not the current leadership's principal decision maker, Yahya Sinwar, on one hand, and the government of Israel on the other. The War Cabinet has already approved this. The question is whether or not, if brought to the full cabinet, the full cabinet will approve it. Hamas has no stake in responding comprehensively quickly. I mean, their calculation is Israel is under increasing pressure from the U.S., the international community, hostage families. Sinwar is trading time, tunnel, and hostages for what he really wants, which is the preservation of his leadership and the continuation of Hamas in some form in the politic of post-October 7 Gaza. So right now, I think this proposal is increasingly fraught, because you don't have the sense of urgency on either side that matches the President Biden's.
Let's talk a little bit about that sense of urgency, if we could. This proposal was ostensibly laid out by Biden, but he said it was put forward by Israel. However, Israeli leaders have walked that back and say they will continue to pursue their military aims in Gaza. Can you make sense of that?
Well, the War Cabinet approved it. That doesn't mean that every cabinet minister agreed. And Netanyahu has also put out several statements which raise some questions, although I know one thing about negotiations: parties interpret it to their respective publics as they want. So I think, again, if Hamas responds with a yes or a no or imposes additional conditions, there may be no need for the proposal to be brought to the full cabinet. If Hamas wants to play this game tactically, they would agree to this and let the full cabinet, the full Israeli cabinet, decide, which could prove highly embarrassing to the Prime Minister, whose Knesset majority rests with 65 seats. And above all, his major objective is to maintain himself in power. That's part of the problem. I have no brief for Hamas, a vicious terrorist organization that killed indiscriminately, raped, and murdered and tortured and took hostages. But let's be very clear. Benjamin Netanyahu was the worst possible leader at the worst possible time in the worst possible circumstance. And therein, with respect to both Hamas's and Israel's motives in this, therein lies the problem.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for right now. That was Aaron David Miller. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Now let's bring in Sultan Barakat. He's a professor for public policy, an expert on conflict management, and the founder of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute. Welcome to DW. What's your take on this proposal? Is it a good one?
Well, obviously, it's a good one in the sense that it is probably the only hope we have at the moment to bring an end to the conflict and to allow the two sides to reach a reasonable agreement. It will never meet the main objective of either side, but I think it provides a compromise. And it's interesting that if you look at the details, it's not really very far from what Hamas has accepted 10 days ago or so. The real problem remains on the side of Israel. And I think what's happening now, it seems like there is a split within the war cabinet within Israel, with Gantz, Benny Gantz, maybe taking the lead now. And I suspect what has been proposed by Biden has largely been worked by him and the head of the Israeli intelligence, because it is very much against what Netanyahu would like to see and what Gallant would like to see. Netanyahu and Gallant are still determined to see the end of Hamas first, that the total destruction of its military capability and its governance capability. And for them, that is total victory. And then they're willing to talk about potential withdrawal. So what we have at the moment, I think it's potentially could be a good start. It really depends on how Israel reacts to the proposal.
Hamas says it views the deal positively. Why would Hamas take any deal as long as Israel has a stated goal of eliminating them militarily?
Well, I mean, what they've taken from the deal are the key issues. The deal talks about a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire. It is calling for Israeli withdrawal, although it's talking about withdrawal from inhabited areas. And there aren't many inhabited areas lived in areas by the Palestinians in Gaza. And it is also talking about a commitment to reconstruction and a commitment to release Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the Israeli hostages. So those elements have always been the elements that Hamas has called for. Obviously, they will continue to be suspicious of Israel and its reaction and whether it will implement the three phases as Biden foresee them, because from the experience so far, they don't seem to listen to what Biden say, and Biden is not able to really implement any of his threats. He has introduced a number of red lines for Israel over the last 7 months. All those red lines were crossed, and there was no consequence. So I think the only worry on the mind of Hamas today would be whether, if they were to go into this phased approach, whether the Israelis will go phase one, phase two, the release of the hostages, and then they will have a change of heart and go after them for their total destruction. But at the moment, both sides really have very little to bargain with. Hamas, as you could see, are pushed right against the fence, and the Israelis, day by day, are losing their international allies. They're losing their international reputation. Now, it's not only the ICJ after Israel, the ICC has called for the warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant. So they are really in a very difficult position.
Thank you very much, Sultan Barakat, Professor for Public Policy. Thanks for your analysis.
Let's take a look at the proposal in more detail. President Biden said that in a first phase lasting 6 weeks, Israel and Hamas would enter a full and complete ceasefire. Israeli forces would withdraw from populated areas of Gaza. Hamas would release a number of hostages, including the elderly, women, and the wounded. In exchange, Israel would release hundreds of Palestinian detainees. Humanitarian aid for Gaza would surge at this point, with at least 600 trucks being allowed into Gaza each day. In the proposal's second phase, Hamas would release all remaining living hostages, including male Israeli soldiers. All hostilities would end and Israeli forces would fully withdraw from Gaza. Once these steps have been accomplished, Hamas would hand over the remains of all dead hostages it's still holding. Rubble in Gaza's cities would then be cleared and reconstruction of the territory backed by the U.S., Europe, and international institutions would begin. Turn to conflict negotiator Oliver McTernan, who joins us. Oliver, thanks for your time. There's a lot of detail in what Biden announced. As a conflict negotiator, do you think that was a good idea?
Well, there's nothing new in what he is saying. Is what they have done is reordered the timetable, as it were. Now, I think it's good to have an overall plan. If he had just announced, okay, a 60-day ceasefire in which certain hostages will be exchanged, and then we'll see what will happen, I think it would be less appealing, and we probably wouldn't have got the positive response we did from Hamas. But at the end of the day, I think he needs to go further. It's no good announcing it unless he is prepared to really stand by his words. It's time to see the war in Gaza ended. Only America, I think, can actually achieve that goal, because it's only they that can have the real influence on the Israeli cabinet at present, and that is they supply the means by which Israel can prosecute the war. If they are serious about ending it, then they must tell them, this is the time you have to make a deal.
And then meanwhile, you have Netanyahu saying that any deal must include, quote, the elimination of Hamas militarily. That wasn't in the proposal announced by Biden. So where do things stand? What does that mean for negotiations?
Well, I would think, Melissa, it complicates it unbelievably, and I think intentionally. Right from the beginning, Netanyahu set two goals. First, the elimination of Hamas, and alongside that, the return of the hostages. Now, those goals, for anyone familiar with hostage negotiation and achieving a level of agreement that could enable this to happen, is acutely aware that these are incompatible. And I see, in a way, Netanyahu nodding the head to Biden on the one hand, but at the same time saying to his supporters and those in his cabinet and outside his cabinet, there's a real cross-party consensus that Hamas should be eliminated for the future security of Israel. He's nodding to them as well. So, you know, it remains to be seen how this will progress. The big challenge, I think, is moving from not getting number one, the 30-day ceasefire, but it will be moving from that first stage, if it goes successfully, into the second stage. And what effectively I think the Americans are asking Netanyahu to do in agreeing to a permanent ceasefire is, in fact, to end his political career. Because many would say that once the military operation is over, then the day of accountability begins. And many predict that will be when Netanyahu will have to stand down as prime minister. So I see lots of obstacles in the way and along the way.
Very quickly, I mean, you mentioned ceasefire. How likely is that part of it?
Well, a good positive response, if the reporting is right from Hamas, hopefully it's a first step. The people of Gaza, 2.3 million people, are enduring insufferable conditions daily, which will have long-term consequences on their whole way of life. It's profound changes have taken place. We need a ceasefire now, and hopefully both sides will, for no other reason than pure humanitarian reasons, will agree to that stage. And then hopefully political pressure will affect the second stage.
Oliver McTernan, thank you so much for joining us.